The helicopter sliced through the brittle cold of the Icelandic highlands, its rotors throwing a harsh wind that whipped snowflakes against the windows in a furious swirl. I sat strapped into the passenger seat, muscles tense against the roar, and cold seeping through the thin glass. Below, the jagged rim of Askja caldera opened wide, a bowl of ice and stone carved deep into the earth's crust, where the sky bled cold and the air hung heavy with steam from unseen heat far beneath the frozen surface. My fingers pressed tight against the armrest as the pilot guided us toward the landing zone near Víti Crater Lake, that unnatural pool whose blue depths held a silence deeper than any ocean. Outside, the landscape was sharp and brutal, fields of cracked basalt and ancient lava flows frozen in time but fractured like old bone. I kept my eyes on the rising steam vents, little columns puffing through fissures and pooling in pockets across the cracked ground. Heat still moved below, though the surface remained locked in ice. The snow clung stubbornly to jagged ridges and drifted into every hollow, undisturbed beneath a low gunmetal sky. A distant rumble rolled through the valley, barely more than a tremor, pressing against my chest and reminding me why I was here. I slid my pack forward, feeling the dull weight of instruments and thermal sensors ready to unspool beneath the frozen soil. This wasn't my first trip here, but the cold closed off every sense until all that remained was the raw bite of wind and the steady pulse of heat beneath my boots. I pulled my hood tighter, catching the sulfur-tinged air that smelled bitter and sharp. The landing gear skittered over the frozen earth as we touched down. Snow crunched under the skids, packed hard and glassy. I unstrapped and pushed the door open, the cold biting immediately. The wind hit like a blade, stealing breath and biting skin beneath layers of Gore-Tex. Around us, the ground steamed softly, invisible heat writhing beneath a crust of frost. Erin stepped out first, her boots cutting neat lines through the snow. She didn't speak, only scanned the horizon with eyes that seemed to read the land's secrets. Behind her, Marlin's breath came in quick bursts, a quiet energy bouncing off the bleak terrain despite the sharp wind. Washington moved slower, each step measured and exact, as if the years he carried weighed down the very air. We moved toward the crumbling shell of the Cold War-era research facility, half buried beneath drifts and moss that had long since claimed the outer walls. Its steel skeleton poked from the ground like a fractured rib cage, glass shards glittering faintly in weak light. I knelt beside the obsidian sign marking the entrance, fingers brushing the black stone. Sharp runes were etched deep, biting into the glassy surface. Erin's voice was low when she spoke. "If it cools, it sleeps." The words hung heavy between the cold and the heat beneath us. I pulled the thermal scanner from my pack, fingers numb despite gloves. The readings blinked erratic, spikes where there should have been steady decline, heat surging from cracks sealed beneath basalt layers. It wasn't normal. Something stirred beneath the frozen crust, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm that felt too exact to be natural. Marlin crouched beside me, tracing lines of brittle data stained with age. "Look at this," he said, voice tight with a mix of excitement and worry. "The geothermal logs show a steady climb in temperature over the past month, even though the surface vents stay mostly cold." I stared toward Víti Lake, its surface dull slate with steam rising in curling plumes. The water's temperature was higher than recorded in decades. A tight knot formed in my stomach. Heat beneath ice shouldn't behave like this. The earth was speaking in a language older and stranger than any science I'd learned. Something beneath the surface was waking. We set up base camp near the rim, tents pitched low against the wind, anchored with heavy rocks and steel spikes hammered into frozen soil. The wind didn't ease, it pressed around us like a living thing, carrying whispers that slipped just beyond hearing. Erin kept watching distant shadows, odd dark shapes moving beyond the veil of steam. She didn't say much, but her silence held weight. Night came with sudden quiet, the wind dropping until only the faint hiss of geothermal vents remained. The sky was clear, a thin veil of clouds blurring the stars into pale smudges. I walked to the camp's edge, boots crunching on frozen rock, breath steaming in the cold air. Across a distant clearing, I saw it, a tall, thin shape glowing faintly where cracks of molten rock bled light beneath steam. It was bipedal but shifted, limbs blurred by rising heat waves. Our eyes locked, a flicker of something ancient in its gaze, then it vanished, swallowed by mist and shadow. The drone we'd sent out earlier buzzed faintly overhead before diving and spiraling, dropping silent into the snow. Later, we recovered the footage, heat signatures moving with purpose beneath the rock, shapes too large and slow to be animals, but not mechanical. The cold pressed harder now, as if the land itself held its breath. I pulled my jacket tighter and looked once more toward the steaming fissures, the ancient earth cracking beneath our feet. The embers of something older than fire still glowed beneath the ice, waiting for the cold to slip and the silence to break. The snow began slowly, thin flakes drifting down from a sky heavy with thick clouds that had gathered since morning. By midday, the cold had settled in, pressing through layers of insulated fabric and wool against my skin. The wind had dropped, leaving an eerie stillness where every crunch of boots on frozen earth rang out sharp and clear. The landscape shifted under the snow's weight, ridges, fissures, and rough basalt fields softened beneath a thickening blanket, the familiar edges of Askja caldera blurring into an endless pale stretch. Even as the white cover grew, the edges of steaming vents resisted, melting the snow into hissing plumes that swirled in shifting curtains of mist. We moved with care, mindful of the slick black ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. Erin led, her footsteps steady as she traced a path along the edge of a concealed lava tube we'd spotted earlier. Its entrance was marked by a jagged crack in the earth, yawning open beneath the fragile crust. The tube swallowed light and sound, its darkness thick and suffocating. I followed close, breath puffing out in mist, ears sharp for any faint shift or groan from the unstable walls. Inside, the air was different, thicker, warmer, heavy with the sharp scent of sulfur and something metallic, coppery beneath the steam. Wisps rose from cracks in the walls and pulled at our feet, swirling slow and quiet beneath our flashlights. The heat pressed against my skin, making the damp cold sting sharper by contrast. Every step echoed hollow in the stone curve. I brushed the rough basalt walls, slick with condensation that hissed quietly when it met the warmer rock. Halfway in, the tube narrowed and bent low, forcing us to crouch. The stone here had changed, black in patches fused with lighter, fragile material. I knelt, sweeping my light over the surface and saw fragments trapped in the glassy rock, bits of bone and ash, pressed flat like grisly fossils. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Erin spoke softly, voice low and distant. They were here before us. No one replied. Merrick stayed close, scanning with his spectrometer, but the silence gnawed at his focus. While running a routine check, he stepped down a narrow side fissure. I called after him. Static answered. Minutes later he returned, his boots gone, bare feet leaving wet marks on the icy floor. His clothes were dry, untouched by the constant snow outside. His eyes held something far away, a flicker of unspoken fear. Down there. Moving slow, glowing beneath the rock. Watching. The words hung heavy. When I pressed for more, he looked away, shaking as he pulled his jacket tighter. It wasn't human. Not like anything I've seen. It melted into the steam, but its eyes, they burned. Suddenly the air chilled further, steam thickening into cold mist that wrapped around us like a living thing. Our recorders picked up low murmurs from the vents, whispers tangled with the hiss of escaping heat. The devices decoded nothing, but the unease grew. Washington pulled out her worn notebook, tracing faded Cold War warnings inked decades before. It's not geothermal, she said quietly. It feeds. It waits beneath, bound by heat and pressure. When the warmth fades, it wakes. Night came fast, the snow thickening and swallowing the camp and craters edged beneath a harsh cold. The lake's surface gleamed faintly under a thin ice layer, steam rising in thick curling tendrils that blurred the horizon. Without warning, the ground trembled, A brief sharp jolt that shook loose gravel from the cliffs. Instruments flickered, then died. Screens went dark, one after another. The silence that followed pressed heavier than before. Hours passed. Water crept across the lake's frozen edge, rising nearly 2 feet. Snow piled deep, cutting off the path back to the helicopter and tightening the circle around us. The wind returned, low and steady, howling against the tents with a force that carried voices on its breath. I stood at camp's edge, staring toward the opaque horizon where steam and snow merged. The cold bit at my face, but beneath the layers, something deeper burned, slow and steady, an ember of dread. The earth beneath us stirred in ways I couldn't yet understand. Whatever moved beneath the ice was waiting for us to slip.
The snow had stopped, but the cold hadn't lifted. It settled in heavy, pressing against the skin and seeping into bone. The wind had fallen quiet again, and in its absence, the crater felt enormous, an open void of silence and stillness, wrapped in steam and pale frost. Every sound we made, boots over frozen stone, tent flaps creaking in stiff wind, rang louder than it should have. The geothermal scanners hummed and blinked weakly against the cold, their readings fluctuating more with each passing hour. We left camp early. Erin led, hunched forward, her coat stiff from frost, her ice-crusted gloves wrapped tight around a handheld sensor. Merrick walked behind her, boots crunching over the snow with uneven rhythm, still limping from the previous day's climb. I brought up the rear, head low against the shallow gusts that blew fine powder into our path. We followed a line of vent markers north of the caldera rim, toward a stretch where the ice had recently melted in long, smooth curves, like something hot had brushed beneath it from below. Just beyond a wide bank of stone and ice, we reached the collapsed site. A long fracture split the ground, its mouth still steaming where the crust had sheared open the night before. Part of the ridgeline had dropped away entirely, exposing a narrow vertical shaft framed with jagged basalt. Debris dusted the edge, broken chunks of obsidian, fresh crumbled ice, and thin streams of warmth that bled up from somewhere far below. It hadn't been there 2 days ago. We didn't speak for a while. We just watched the way the frost on the rock edges kept melting and reforming, never freezing solid. I clipped a line to a nearby anchor and began the descent. Erin followed. The shaft curved tighter the deeper we went, and within 20 feet, the light from above was gone. The walls glistened with wet mineral streaks, and steam drifted in waves too slow to be wind. Erin called back something about a shelf opening below us, and then I was stepping off rope onto a wide, sloped platform of slick black stone. The air down there was thick, damp, metallic, with a pulsing warmth that radiated from a ventless source. The space opened out into what looked like a natural cavern, but the geometry was wrong. The walls weren't jagged like most lava tubes. They curved too cleanly, bending in long arcs that swept through the chamber like ribs. Not cut by water or flame, but shaped. At the far end, a wall of fused stone bore deep impressions. Not writing, not art, but something scraped deliberately into the rock, over and over again. It wasn't erosion. I moved closer and raised my flashlight. In the middle of the chamber, a deep gouge had been torn through the floor, exposing something beneath. Layers of pale, webbed stone, cracked open with heat still rising from the core. Something had moved here. Not recently, but not long ago either. The stone bore tracks, deep, uneven imprints dragging in long arcs, like something massive had been pulled from the earth, or had pulled itself free. Erin crouched beside the fissure, scanning the edges. She didn't speak, but her body tensed all at once. Then she was reaching in her side pouch, pulling out one of the old Cold War schematics we'd recovered from the abandoned station. Her gloved fingers traced the margins. "This shape was here," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "It matches the contour in Sector D. Look at this arc. This is mapped. Decades ago. I didn't ask how that could be possible. I just stared at the crack in the floor and listened to the faint, rhythmic pulse rising from deep below it. A heat, steady and slow, pushing through the stone like breath through a clenched jaw. We called Merrick down to join us. He moved slower than before, favoring his right side, but his eyes were alert. He stepped carefully into the chamber, holding a field mic against the floor. "There's movement beneath," he said after a minute. "Not seismic. Something else. Repetitive, mechanical, or intentional." It was then the low noise began again. Not through the ground, but above it, through the steam and cavern air. A voice, or something close to it. Something that echoed like speech, but warped and dragging. Thick and broken, like it didn't understand how words were supposed to sound. It came in short bursts, carried on a heat wave that shifted the mist. I couldn't understand it. None of us could. But it reached into the chest like a hand curling around the spine. Merrick backed up, staring into the steam. "It's copying something. It hears us. It's trying to," he trailed off. That's when the cave shook. Not like the usual tremors we'd grown used to. This was sudden sharp. The rock beneath us jerked, then cracked. A portion of the ledge beneath Merrick gave way. He shouted once, arms flailing as the floor split and dragged him downward. Aaron lunged, grabbing his wrist with one hand, the other braced against the crumbling edge. I dropped beside her, anchoring her with my full weight, and together we hauled him back from the collapse. The noise echoed for several seconds, stone on stone, deep rumbles sliding into silence. When it stopped, the air felt wrong. Thin, like something had been displaced. Merrick was hurt, his ankle twisted badly, his leg trembling as he tried to stand. "Something moved under me," he said, voice tight with pain. "Not just a rock. Something under it." We secured him in a field sling, and I climbed back up the shaft ahead of them to rig a pulley. As I ascended, I kept looking down, half expecting something to follow, something to fill that steam-veiled chamber and rise into the dark after us. But nothing came. We got Merrick to the surface. He was pale and shaking, breath short from pain, but alive. The snow had started again, falling fast and heavy. The wind picked up just as we reached the rim, cutting through our gear and driving the frost sideways in sharp blasts. We set up a makeshift shelter near the cave mouth. Merrick was wrapped in insulation, his leg braced. Aaron and I huddled beside him, trading glances toward the hole we'd just escaped. The instruments kept pulsing, temperature climbing, pressure fluctuating, radiation spiking in short bursts. I checked the perimeter just before nightfall. The vents had widened. Steam rose in new plumes where the snow had melted down to blackened stone. And in the distance, where the slope curved down toward the lake, something stood still in the haze. Not moving, not watching, just there. A figure with no face, no edges, blurred by the mist, but tall enough to be seen clearly from 100 yards out. I turned back toward the camp without speaking. Aaron followed. Neither of us said what we'd seen. That night, the wind howled harder than before, rattling the tent flaps like claws on canvas. Beneath us, the ground ticked in pulses, like a heartbeat too slow to be human. Something had shifted beneath the crater. And whatever it was listening now.
The pulse beneath us was louder now, a low vibration rolling through the ground that set every nerve on edge. Then came the first roar, a savage, guttural sound like stone grinding on bone, shaking the rim beneath my feet. "Move!" I shouted, barely hearing my own voice over the sudden blast of wind tearing through the crater. Aaron grabbed Marek's arm, hauling him upright as the ground shuddered violently. The ice cracked beneath us, fissures spider-webbing outward, sending sprays of snow and rock into the air. Without warning, a section of the ridge beside us exploded, chunks of frozen earth and basalt tumbling down the slope in a cascade of debris. A thunderous boom chased after it, drowning out the wind's howl. I grabbed Merrick, pulling him back from the edge just as the ground split open beneath his feet, swallowing part of the frozen trail like a hungry maw. Aaron was already sprinting toward the tents, the whipping wind tearing at her coat. Behind us, a jagged wall of ice and stone cracked loose, crashing down into the crater with a shattering impact that sent a shockwave rippling through the air. The ground beneath the camp lurched again, throwing us off balance. Merrick stumbled, pain flaring in his leg, but we forced him forward. The tents flapped wildly as the wind tore at their anchors. I wrenched loose a metal spike, throwing it hard into the frozen earth to secure a guide rope. A violent gust caught me from the side, nearly knocking me down. Somewhere in the storm's roar, a low, inhuman growl rose, a harsh, rasping sound that didn't belong in the natural world. Aaron's eyes scanned the swirling mist, sharp and wide. Before I could react, a towering shadow emerged through the steam, a massive, twisted shape moving with eerie speed and unsettling fluidity. Limbs stretched too long, joints bending wrong, a face obscured in shifting shadows. It lunged. I dove to the side, snow exploding where it struck the ground moments before. Aaron swung a heavy piece of equipment, a broken shovel handle, striking hard as the creature closed in. It recoiled but didn't retreat, turning its gaze toward Merrick, who collapsed beneath the shelter's meager cover, clutching his injured leg. I grabbed the radio, but only static answered. The creature stalked closer, slow and steady, moving through the chaos like it was woven into the storm itself. Each step crushed ice and stone beneath oversized, clawed feet. The wind howled like a living thing, drowning out screams that didn't come from us. Another tremor rocked the crater, buckling the frozen ground beneath the tent. Tent poles snapped with a sharp crack, canvas tore free and whipped madly into the storm. The creature's growls grew louder, more furious. I grabbed a handful of small rocks and flung them toward the creature's eyes, hoping to buy time. It recoiled again, a flicker of hesitation breaking its monstrous calm. I seized the moment, striking at its limbs with whatever I could find nearby. Merrick cried out, blood seeping through his fingers as he pressed a makeshift bandage to his leg. "We have to hold until morning." Aaron's voice was raw with adrenaline, eyes wild. Another tremor shook the crater, sharp and violent, cracking the ice beneath us. The shelter groaned, threatening to collapse. I braced myself, heart hammering, as the creature let out one final, blood-curdling roar and vanished back into the swirling mist, leaving only the echo of its menace behind. The storm hadn't eased. If anything, it had grown worse, wind tearing across the crater like a wild beast, snow slashing in cold sheets that stung every exposed patch of skin. The ground beneath us trembled in short, unpredictable bursts, the frozen crust cracking and shifting as if the very earth wanted to break free. The tents were little more than shredded fabric, barely clinging to a few battered poles, and Marek's injured leg throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that no bandage could soothe. We couldn't stay. Not here. But the storm had sealed us in tighter than ever. The helicopter was a distant hope, buried beneath feet of snow on a runway likely lost to the wind's fury. We had to find another way out. I grabbed the pack, hoisting it heavy against my back, the weight grounding me in the chaos. Aaron helped Merrick to his feet, supporting most of his weight, her breath ragged but steady. The creature could return any moment, drawn by the noise, the scent, the desperate movement. We moved toward the jagged ridge where the last cave entrance lay, our only chance to find shelter and maybe a way down from this forsaken rim. The snow crunched underfoot, and every step was a battle against the wind that sought to throw us off balance. As we climbed, the ground gave a sudden, violent shudder. I barely caught Aaron before she slipped, and Merrick let out a sharp grunt of pain, collapsing briefly on the frozen stone. The earth wasn't just moving, it was breaking apart. Above us, the sky was a swirling mass of dark clouds, low and heavy. The air smelled of ozone and ash, like the breath of something ancient waking beneath the ice. Inside the cave, the heat was immediate and thick, a choking presence that pressed against our lungs. Steam curled from fissures in the walls, whispering in voices I couldn't understand. Shadows shifted at the edges of the light, flickering in the glow of our flashlights. We found evidence of old activity, scorch marks on the stone, strange glyphs etched deep into the walls, layers of ash that had settled in thick patches. Erin ran her fingers over the symbols, silent but focused. These marks were clearly warnings. Or prayers. Something kept here, held down by those who came before. Marek's eyes flicked to the narrow tunnel ahead, the only way deeper into the mountain. His breath was shallow, sweat mixing with the grime on his face. There was no other choice. We had to go forward. The passage narrowed quickly, forcing us to move single file. The temperature rose with every step, sweat freezing on our brows even as the air grew hotter. The walls closed in, dark and slick, until the faint glow of an underground chamber spilled ahead. The cavern was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadow, walls pulsing with a faint heat that wasn't natural. At its center lay a pit, black and bottomless, from which a low hum radiated, vibrating through our bones. Around it, ancient relics lay scattered, rusted tools, shattered stone tablets, bones bleached white. I stepped closer, and the hum grew louder, filling the chamber with a sound like the world itself was breathing. Aaron bent down, picking up a tablet and tracing the worn carvings. The inscription spoke of a guardian. A beast born of fire and cold, bound beneath the earth to keep the balance. But if the seal breaks... The ground beneath us quaked violently, dust and loose rock tumbling from the ceiling. We scrambled back as a deep, guttural growl echoed from the pit, shaking the very air. The creature was here, something ancient and terrible, hungry for freedom. Marek gritted his teeth, struggling to stand. The situation was critical. We needed to reinforce the seal, or everything would be lost. Erin pulled from her pack a coil of heavy cable and a set of makeshift anchors. If we could reroute the geothermal vents, cool the core, maybe it would stay down a little longer. I nodded, swallowing the knot of fear tightening in my throat. We set to work immediately, racing against tremors that rocked the cavern with increasing frequency. The cables strained, the anchors bit into the stone, but the earth was fighting back. Small fissures snaked along the floor, steam vents burst open, and the pit seemed to pulse, alive and angry. Suddenly, the air shifted. The creature's presence was closer, a cold wave that swept over us, sapping strength and hope. From the shadows, a hulking form emerged, twisted limbs, eyes like burning coals, and a maw that opened wider than any animal's should. Erin screamed, dropping her tools as the beast lunged. I threw myself in front, striking with a steel bar, hearing it clang against something like bone. The creature staggered but did not fall. Marek fired his last flare into the air, the sparks raining down and momentarily blinding the beast. That was our chance. Erin scrambled for the control panel we'd rigged, hands shaking as she activated the emergency cooling system. The pit's hum shifted, the heat dimming as cold water hissed through the pipes, steam condensing into frost. The creature howled, a sound that shook the cavern and rattled our bones, before it finally recoiled and sank back into the darkness below. The shaking slowed, the ground settling, the cavern falling silent once more. We collapsed, gasping, wounds fresh and bodies exhausted, but alive. Outside, the storm had passed. Dawn crept over the horizon, pale and uncertain. But the mountain had changed, and so had we. The seal was fragile. The beast was not gone. And somewhere beneath the ice, the earth still whispered warnings. The air was thin and brittle as we emerged from the shattered cavern, the earth's faint pulse reduced to a quiet, uneasy murmur beneath the frozen crust. The fragile seal held, for now. Around us, the cavern's entrance was crumbling, chunks of stone loose and sliding into the dark like forgotten bones. Each step outside felt heavier, as if the mountain itself exhaled a slow, cold warning. Marek leaned heavily on Erin, his injured leg throbbing with every careful step. His face was pale, eyes clouded but sharp with determination. I could feel the weight of exhaustion settling over us all, bodies battered, minds stretched to breaking, but alive. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape reshaped by fury, snowdrifts piled high, wind-scoured ridges stripped bare, and the steam vents hissing soft warnings into the cold. The sky hung low and gray, the sunlight weak and washed out, like a half-forgotten memory. We moved slowly toward the helicopter site, each crunch of frozen snow beneath our boots a reminder that the land was still unsettled. The radio crackled weakly, barely strong enough to send a distress call, a lifeline flickering across the vast empty wild. Rescue was coming, but hours, maybe days away. As we walked, the terrain shifted beneath our feet, fresh fissures spider-webbed across frozen ground, and the occasional faint heat anomaly rose from hidden pockets, like breath from the earth's wounds. Erin glanced down at the footprints that trailed behind us. Odd shapes, indistinct, some too large to belong to any animal we knew. She spoke quietly, voice raw from hours of straying. Those glyphs, they weren't just warnings. They were a pact, a binding. Something made to keep the balance, to hold the beast beneath. I swallowed hard, the ancient weight of that knowledge settling deep inside. The mountain wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a prison, and a silent witness to horrors we could barely comprehend. My mind raced back to the cavern, the deep pit, the pulsing heat, the creature's eyes, burning coals in the shadows, filled with hunger and rage. And yet it was bound. For now. The bitter cold crept beneath my layers, but a colder fear nestled deeper. The fragile boundary between the known and the unknowable had been cracked. The seal weakened. At the rim, the helicopter's distant drone finally pierced the stillness. Relief washed over us, but unease lingered, as if the mountain watched, waiting. We climbed aboard, the rotors kicking up swirling snow that masked the land below. From above, the crater looked peaceful, serene even, a pale bowl of ice and steam kissed by the pale morning light. I stared out the window, heart tight. The seal might hold today, but the mountain's whisper was far from silent. Beneath the ice, beneath the stone, something still stirred. And the earth held its breath. As the chopper climbed higher, the scene below faded into a mist of white and shadow. Yet deep beneath the frozen surface, unseen and silent, a faint, steady pulse echoed, a reminder that some ancient things do not rest forever.